Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce's AI webinar series. Garrett Sheehan, our president and CEO, is on vacation this week, so I will be kicking us off. My name is Victoria Verderam, and I am the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the Chamber. So excited today to have Rock Vitale, who, if many of you attended our annual meetings and awards last month, would know that he was just awarded as our Volunteer of the Year. He is also the CEO and founder of Easie. And we are going to talk today about auditing your organization for AI readiness. And the key takeaways are all listed for you there. Like I said, very excited to have Rock. He is, has been an AI expert in so many ways and has helped our chamber, particularly with the AI Policy Summit last August. So very excited to have Rock with us today. But before we do, we are going to hear a video from our sponsor, Charter Oak.
Connecticut is rising. Let's elevate. Let's innovate. The future of work is now, and Connecticut is leading the charge. AI tools are no longer just for tech giants. They're for real work, right here, right now. Small businesses, nonprofits, educators, and emerging talent, this is built for you. Together, we're building a stronger Connecticut workforce. The Connecticut AI Academy, powered by Charter Oak State College. Connecticut is...
And just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be available after it's concluded. So, Rock, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Victoria. And thank you to the Chamber for hosting this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting this webinar on auditing your organization for AI readiness. And just a reminder that, as I'm giving this presentation, there's a Q&A box. And if you do have a question, feel free to drop the question in there and either we'll answer it kind of as we're going, or there'll be a time at the end to answer questions. So, definitely if something comes to you, feel free to ask it, share an anecdote or a question or any other strategic insights you might have. Okay. So I think we talked a little bit about me already. I'm the founder and CEO of Easie. We do implementation of advanced technology systems. We do a lot of work in AI, but we don't just work in AI. We also work in sort of traditional automation and setting up things like apps and automated tools as well. And so, our organization was founded in 2018. We've completed over 600 projects. We've worked across different sectors in Connecticut, and we see real opportunity for all kinds of organizations, whether it's small businesses, nonprofits, even the public sector, to turn AI and automation solutions into tangible outcomes. These systems are powerful and useful, and the goal of this presentation is really just to help you sort of have a framework for how to think about these things. So here's some of our clients. Really the goal of this session is just to help you, like I was just saying, have a framework, think about the sort of high level ways to sort of approach these kinds of questions and say, do I really need AI in this situation? Why does AI readiness matter in this case? Is automation actually a better solution? We are sort of hit over the head with AI every day, and we see people, saying AI is the solution to everything. And, we're definitely in a situation where oftentimes people just sort of press ahead with some AI implementation pilot project in a way that can potentially be risky or have a lower chance of success if not done properly. So the goal of this is to really close the readiness gaps and help you be in a position where you feel a little more qualified to make these decisions. So why is this important? So there was an MIT study done in 2025 that found that 67% of internal AI projects never reach production deployment, meaning they never leave the pilot project stage. That's really, shocking in my mind and interesting at the same time that such a high percentage are stuck in what we call pilot project purgatory. You get into this situation where the team starts the initiative, they feel busy, but it doesn't really actually move the needle on productivity or making your operations better. Worst case scenario, you could even end up in a situation where your operations are, in fact, less efficient or less accurate, introducing risk and frustration kind of at all sides of the business. And ultimately, the problem doesn't get solved. Some warning signs that can happen with that, buying tools before you audit the problems that you're trying to fix, um, or automating a broken process, essentially a process that should be improved before you apply technology to it. Now with technology, you still have a broken process, but you're just breaking it faster. Not having evaluation metrics, no clear success metrics tied to your business, and there's no ownership. There's not necessarily a person that's sort of in charge of seeing it through to success. We'll talk about all of these things in more detail, but um, you're much more likely to succeed if you audit your organization for AI readiness before you just kind of dive in. And I think everybody's sort of used the sort of big three, the Chat GPT and the Claude and Gemini tools of the world, the Notebook LM from Google tools. And those are all really interesting and cool, but in order to actually have these be in sort of a production use case, besides just sort of chatting with it, you really have to do, pretty in-depth configuration to make sure it's working properly. And we'll talk a little bit about this. The goal is not necessarily to show as many like examples of actually implementing these systems, but it goes without saying these systems go with beyond chatbots, and we'll touch on that as well. Some of you may be using Copilot as well within the Microsoft ecosystem, and that could be a whole webinar in itself. But even for those tools, you really want to be thinking about your pain points and sort of mapping them against the sort of operational requirements of your group. So, reframing the question, I know there's a lot of sort of top-down requests to use AI, and in some cases, people's compensation is partially based on their usage of AI. But we offer a different sort of way to think about it. It's not just should we use AI, it's what pain points should we solve, and when does AI actually help it? So it's not really a technology question, and it's more of an operations question. Each organization is different, and depending on what you're doing, there's different sort of degrees of sophistication with these automated systems. So I keep talking about this, AI versus automation. What's the difference? Not necessarily going to read the whole slide here, but traditional software follows rules. It does pretty much the exact same thing every single time. It's what you would call deterministic. Basically, you get an input, you get an output, and it always works exactly the same. It's traditional software, basically. It's, hey, when I submit a form on this website, it pushes a record to my CRM or Salesforce or whatever. Pretty straightforward. If I write an email and I press the send button, it sends this exact email to this person. And oftentimes, a traditional algorithm is very, very robust, and you don't necessarily always need to introduce AI, because with AI, these are best suited for systems that have some level of ambiguity or variation in a way that it's harder to design a sort of rule-based algorithm around it. So with AI, we're talking about can handle dramatic variation. It could handle unstructured data, so like a blob of text, for example, images, speech, all kinds of different file types. It can produce judgments. In other words, it can classify things. It can, say like, does this content contain certain materials? So for example, like you could have like a bill during, the Connecticut legislative session. You could say like, does this relate to water regulation, for example? And, you can have sort of judgment based on that. Systems improve over time. If you got your finger on the pulse of the industry, some would say some of the new models perhaps don't always perform as good as the old models, but I digress a little bit. They do largely perform over time, though. I'm being a little facetious, but no doubt these systems have dramatically improved, especially in the past year. But that being said, they can be less deterministic. In other words, the same input can sometimes yield different outputs. So, you can test this. Like if you say hello to Chat GPT or Claude 100 times, you're going to get 100 different answers, and they might be really similar, but there is a level of variation. There are some controls that you can do to make it more deterministic, which I'm not going to go too far into that because it's more an implementation question. But when you're interacting with a system that you're doing implementation with, there are ways to sort of turn the randomness down, if you will, so that it produces more predictable outputs. But that's, I think it's just a good distinction, because sometimes people will be like, let's just use AI for everything, and that's it's not the answer. So I kind of just touched on this, but basically, if you have clear, stable rules, if it's like, we just did a project, for example, where we had a client, and they had a form that was being submitted on DocuSign, and they needed to push that in a sort of conditional way to Salesforce. That was traditional automation. You're taking the data, you're pushing it somewhere. Clear, stable rules, structured inputs that you're always going to have the same structure every time. High volume systems, that are the same every time. These are all, really good candidates just for traditional automation. And again, like I was saying with AI, if you have sort of unstructured inputs, or if you have extreme variation, chatbot is, of course, a great example of it. People asking all kinds of random questions in different formats. If you need to generate content, or if there's an element where you have different types of files, so it goes beyond just data, you have maybe documents or images or audio. And as a side point, a good example. So we did a project where a client was processing thousands of pages of documents, and they basically needed to extract data from specific pages. It needed to know if the data was on the page, and it needed to extract the data on the page to put it into the structured format. And that's a great example of where AI can be really useful. One of the things that I want to emphasize is that most production systems actually combine both automation and AI. So in the example I just gave, the document gets submitted through automation. You use an AI model to extract the data, put it into a structured format. And then once it's in the structured format, you're using traditional automation again to push it to a database. So it's sort of like automation has sort of sandwiched the AI. But you rarely see an AI model being used without some type of automation attached to it. So again, I won't go too in depth on the actual implementation side of things, but there's sort of 5 different categories that you can think about when you're talking about sort of what people are using AI for in the sort of business world. So you've got creating content. This is something we're probably all familiar with at this point. You can generate reports, emails, document content, Instagram posts, etc., marketing materials. Pretty straightforward. And while we are all familiar with this, it's easy to get this wrong. It's easy to generate something that is like obviously just, for lack of a better word, what some may call AI slop. And you really want to be controlling it with your brand voice, with examples, and with highly specific instructions about what you're looking for to make a sort of better output. Then you've got answer and assist. This one is a slept-on gem, but this is actually a pretty hot topic where you have sort of the ability to search your specific data. So being able to search with natural language. This is where you also have chatbots and agents, but also Q&A tools. So being able to say like, I've got 9,000 documents or whatever, and I need to search it with natural language instead of just keywords, and being able to get highly specific results back. So a good example of this is we're working with a group right now that they have like thousands of videos, and they need to be able to search the videos based on sort of what they're trying to find. So they might need to find a person talking about a specific thing and exactly what timestamp they're talking about it. Hard to do that with keywords. Sort and scan. So being able to classify data, search the data, like I was just saying, and then organizing data on a large scale. This is really interesting because, again, when these things are being submitted, oftentimes somebody has to review it and do something with it, but you can have AI be built in as the review layer before it goes to a human. So it could be like, is this tax return document filled out properly, is a good example of what an AI model could do. Excuse me. Automate admin, replacing back office work. data entry using a computer, conditional routing of data, etc. And then learn and decide. This is fascinating. You can actually have AI tools be almost a companion in educational content. This is sort of a hot topic, and when done properly, AI can actually be extremely helpful in learning outcomes and helping people sort of with professional development and exercises and explaining advanced concepts. When I say learning companion, I mean in the educational sense. I think there's, you see a lot of in the mainstream world, people becoming, friends with AI models, and that's outside the scope of this webinar, but it's philosophically interesting nonetheless. All right, so part 2 of this webinar, critically important, running an operational audit, absolutely critical thing to do before you buy things, before you buy tools or do pilot projects or vendor demos. And one thing I want to emphasize is this step will greatly increase your probability of success. And if you don't do this, it might feel cool to be working on something, or you might have an idea essentially that could be interesting. But if you don't really sort of map out why you're doing it, you might end up just doing something that feels interesting but isn't actually useful. So we have a question here in the Q&A that says, please distinguish between chatbots and AI agents. So it's a really important question. The distinction is essentially a chatbot is more of just pure Q&A. You ask it a question, it answers it. It could be augmented with data from your specific business. So this is something we see all the time where, client wants to install a chatbot on their website that can answer specific questions about their organization. That can actually be really helpful. We installed that for a client recently, and they saw a 25% increase in sales. But it's just pure Q&A for the most part. It could collect some data from the person. It could collect their email address, for example, but it's just a chatbot basically. And then an agent is often able to do other things. So it has access to tools. So it might be like this person gave their email address, and now I can look them up in the CRM automatically and see kind of their past information, or I could see, what they're sort of what they've done in the past if we've interacted with them. And I can interact with a scheduling link. I could create records in a database. I can take actions beyond just answering questions. And that's it's a really hot topic. That's when you hear people talking about agentic AI, they're talking about the ability to go beyond answering questions and the ability to take actions autonomously based on a set of rules, similar to what an agent would do in sort of the human context. Sometimes these actions that the AI model takes can still require human approval, and that's where, again, you want your workflow that's unique to your organization to be, part of this audit before you just sort of pull the trigger on something. Excuse me. Okay, so running the audit. So again, like I was just saying, you've got some questions you want to ask yourself. One of the big traps we see groups falling into is they just buy a tool before understanding the process. And again, that can often just lead to having like a nice system that automates a broken workflow, a workflow that's failing, but now it's failing faster and in new and exciting ways. And these tools can be expensive, no question. I've seen people spend almost 100K. Like before we got involved, I remember we talked to this one group. They had spent about $75,000 on this tool, and the vendor had said it was going to take 3 months to implement. They were 18 months in, and it still didn't work. And it was just a disaster. And they didn't need it. At the end of the day, they didn't even need it. But they were sort of locked in at that point. So you really don't want to do that. I feel like I'm kind of emphasizing that, sort of feeding the fed horse, if you will. But 5 questions to ask before you buy anything. Where are we spending the most time on manual entry or repetitive tasks? Oftentimes, the most boring work is the work that is the highest candidate for automation, the low-hanging fruit, if you will. Number 2, are we moving data between systems by hand? That's a huge thing that we see all the time. Data duplication, things living in spreadsheets, etc. Number 3, could somebody less experienced follow up on the current process end to end, or sorry, follow our current process end to end? In other words, like, is our process even well documented and understood? And then where do the same questions come up over and over again? So it could be clients asking you questions. It could be internally you're getting the same questions, etc. And then which steps break, get skipped, or cause rework most often? So if you've ever had an incident where you've had to do a root cause analysis, or you've had the process break down in some way where someone forgets to do something, or worst case scenario, it's just tribal knowledge. It's sort of institutional memory where people just know to do it just because they've always done it or whatever, and it's just sort of trapped in somebody's memory. You've got what's called the key man risk. These are good questions to ask kind of on a high level. But zooming in on that even further, um, inside your organization, this could look like, tons of manual entry, disconnected systems, people emailing stuff to each other. You see that all the time. Uh, Growing volume where, in some cases, people are just spending all day sort of dealing with this repetitive manual work, but the work is sort of scaling faster. You've got employees that are sort of perpetually behind, and their job is sort of designed around being perpetually behind, which can be demoralizing, cause burnout. And again, just repetitive questions. You see this all the time. Data living in spreadsheets is a pretty big sort of usual suspect, if you will, that we see all the time, where it's like, this department has a spreadsheet with this data, but then this other department has this other spreadsheet that has the same data, and they're duplicating it. And if it gets updated, it can go out of sync. We had a client that was working in the staffing industry, and they had something called the database, and it actually ended up being a spreadsheet with 20,000 rows in it, and it would take like 10 minutes to load, and they used it for critical business operations. And excuse me, got a frog in my throat. Excuse me. One day they accidentally like deleted a column, and it broke all the formulas, and they were in a state of crisis, like significant crisis for a while. And so that was obviously not a good situation. Spreadsheets are useful, but not for production database purposes. And this is all just to say, asking about your pain points. What are your hair on fire problems? Only you know what that is. And through an audit, you can document that in more detail. So one way to think about this is what we call the Easie pain point prioritization matrix. So this is a framework that we came up with to take these questions and to put them into a prioritized list after you do your audit. So in sort of auditing languages, this is what you would call your severity score prior to assigning your corrective actions. So back in the matrix here, really straightforward. The ones that you want to focus on the top priority are high impact and high frequency. So things that are critically important to your business that happen all the time. After that, high impact, low frequency. So some of these like more rare events that are still really impactful, sort of medium priority, middle of the road. And then low impact, high frequency. So it might be something that's not necessarily, like life or death, but it's something you have to deal with all the time. That could be as simple as like, somebody fills out a form and I have to put it into another system or something. And then, the ones that are low priority or low impact, low frequency. And ironically, these can be the ones that people do because they feel cool. So it's, we often see before someone does an audit, somebody's like, yeah, like we automated this, like we spent like 40 hours doing this. And it's like, okay, but that didn't move the needle in any sort of meaningful way. So use the matrix. So you brainstorm, you gather these pain points across teams, not just leadership. You rate the items, the pain points, if you will, on this matrix. You don't need to do some, deep quantitative analysis. Oftentimes just sort of gut level, like, sticky note exercise even is sufficient. This doesn't need to be, like a second job doing this. It's basically just, what your pain points are. Plotting them. And again, you could even do this in like a workshop format. And then pilots, where you attack the highest impact, highest frequency problems first. Groundbreaking stuff. But this is probably the most important slide of this presentation, just to say that when you're doing your pain point analysis throughout your organization, you have to think about it this way, or otherwise you'll just have a giant list of stuff that'll never get done. And so that's all just to say, what is your hair on fire problem? Again, only you know this. The matrix is a conversation tool. This is meant to be interactive. Your team and your teammates generally know what these are. And, we've seen that these systems, when implemented properly after doing this, can be substantially impactful. So we had an organization that we were working with that was doing extreme amounts of billing. So they were doing basically disbursements of over $100,000 a week. They were paying hundreds of people through this extremely terrible process where they had a spreadsheet, and it was taking them 4 days to run payroll, and it was a nightmare. And they were making mistakes sometimes. And we helped them create a database. We helped them create an automated system that still had ultimately approval mechanisms, but it took their payroll process from 4 days down to 4 hours. And so that, it was like a joyous day for those people. But that was an example of like an extreme, high impact, high frequency problem that was certainly hair on fire. Um, and so I kind of mentioned this earlier, but the top thing you can do if you're a business leader is to do this sort of management by walking around techniques. You could do a workshop, or you could do one-on-one interviews, but talk to your frontline teams, talk to management, um, talk to other people within leadership. This is definitely a mistake that we see leaders making sometimes, where they just sort of decide what you're going to work on. They sort of go off vibes, if you will. And if you're a super small business, if you're like a 5-person team, that might be fine. But you can't go off vibes if you have a bigger organization. If you are, dealing with tons of employees or whatever, or you have all these departments, you really want this to be comprehensive. Not just because you'll get better results, but also because people will feel more involved. It's often easy to underestimate the human element of this, where if you start implementing AI and automation without people feeling involved, it can cause a little friction. We've seen that happen where, if you're changing the process that people have done for a long time, it can be destabilizing, and legitimately so. I think that, people generally don't like change, and change can be scary. AI can cause uncertainty. That they could wonder, like, especially in this current business climate, like, what does this mean for my future? So having people feel like their voices are heard is critically important in this process as well. One anecdote that I'll share with you is that, at least for us in our work doing AI and automation implementation, people generally are not laying people off when they are doing these projects. Really, what's usually happening is people are able to focus on higher impact tasks. And there's actually studies that show that after the implementation of AI, people's work intensity can increase, rather than they're just obsolete or whatever. You very much need humans in the loop to accomplish business. Anybody that tells you that AI can automate a system 100% is definitely trying to sell you something, for sure. For pretty much every system that we see, there's semi-automated processes where some of these things that we're talking about, of like classification, content generation, et cetera, are happening. Data is being passed back and forth automatically. But people are still very much alerted, like if something is an anomaly, or they're approving things before they actually go out the door. So definitely, keep in mind that humans are still very essential workers, if you will, for the world of business. Okay, so there's a few other kind of things to think about after you do this sort of audit before you build. One thing I would say that we see a lot is that people have a bunch of data, but it's not always wrangled, if you will. So you've got a situation where you might have, like I said, data in spreadsheets, or you have data in a bunch of PDFs, or you might have data in a bunch of paper files that are not digitized at all. Or the data might be in inconsistent format. They might be trapped in emails, all kinds of things that can happen with the data here. Process maturity again, how documented is your underlying process? Is it based on tribal knowledge or vibes, or is it a situation where it's like we do it this exact same way every time? We use checklists, etc. Um, Spoiler alert, you really want to be what's called boringly consistent with the processes. So if you don't have the processes even mapped, you might need to do that kind of before sort of upstream of building things. So get your workflows in order. And again, if you're automating a broken process, you're just breaking things faster critically. Um, AI policy and governance. So I'll talk more about this on another slide, but if you do go down the road of having AI systems be used in your business, you want to have an AI policy. You want to have approved use cases, data handling rules, and an internal owner for AI governance. And um, if you don't, what's going to end up happening is your employees are just going to secretly use ChatGPT or Claude. It just is what it is. Um, Team readiness. Again, do you have buy-in? Are people trained on what AI is going to change about their work? Um, because without this, you could have the coolest tool, but if people stage a mutiny, or if they don't understand why it's important, or they just aren't trained, it's just not going to get used. It'll be existing, but it'll be existing in a way that is sort of in stasis. Okay, so the AI policy again. Uh, we recently did a large scale survey, and we found that 40% of organizations have no AI policy in place today. So that's a pretty shocking number. You really want to do this because otherwise it's sort of the Wild West where people are just pasting proprietary data into it. Um, Also, depending on what tools you're using, you need to have them configured so that they're not training on your data. That is a real thing. That is a real concern. And these systems, it can be kind of ambiguous, but it's definitely a situation where it is a setting. If you're a business user, you absolutely can have agreements where they won't use your data for training. And so critically important that you have approved use cases, approved vendors, etc. Data privacy and security, rules for handling sensitive customer or internal data, especially with AI tools, even Copilot. And with this, what's interesting is there's ways to remove some of the data before you give it to the AI system. Oftentimes, you don't need a bunch of email addresses in a spreadsheet that you give to an AI model, or you don't need, um, super specific, unique identifiers. You could have a user ID, or you could have, something that's a little more semi-anonymized, and sort of this principle of least access for the AI model. Security, obviously, is the number one priority of doing anything when we're talking about technology systems. So in addition to having sort of human procedures for what data you can put in, just making sure that you have sort of the basics in place, like encryption at rest, encryption in transit, again, principle of least access, two-factor authentication, the usual suspects. Evaluation mechanisms, verification and review, how employees should verify AI-generated outputs before using them with clients. So we see this in good AI policies. There's actually mechanisms showing that humans required to review things before they ship it. And then ownership, generally having a person within your organization as sort of the AI governance owner, if you will, is critically important. You either have a person or a team be assigned to it so that if changes are required, or if something happens and you need to do a root cause analysis, there's a specific person that's sort of keeping track of this. Because otherwise it becomes this sort of volleyball that people pass around that isn't necessarily owned by anybody. So if something good or bad happens, it's sort of just diffused responsibility, and you end up in a situation where nobody's really feeling responsible for it. It's like if someone's having a medical emergency and you say to someone like, "Hey, you call 911," then they do it. But if someone just yells, "Somebody call 911," nobody does it. It's an interesting psychological phenomenon that happens in AI policies as well. So more on that. Red flags versus green flags. I talked a little bit about this kind of already, but if you have no AI policy, you're definitely not ready yet. You need some level of budget to do these things. So being open to having some financial allocation. It doesn't have to be an extremely expensive exercise depending on what you're doing, but that's something to consider as well. And then, actually, I see a question before I kind of go further into this. It says, how to get team buy-in while many worry about their jobs will be replaced by AI or if you used to learn to use AI. So I think it's a tricky question because each organization is different. You do see situations where people sort of have different opinions about AI, and it definitely can feel, you know, political, for lack of a better word. I think, kind of like what I was just saying, making it clear, like your role is valued here. This is something that is improving the overall efficiency of the organization, and it's a tool that we're using just like every other tool. So in terms of like the actual functionality underneath, it's not that different from using sort of the kind of what you would say, like even your Microsoft Office. Like these are all sort of technology systems that are helping you improve. And so it's just to say that like if people are totally like refusing to use the systems that you need in order for your business to exist, it is worth having a larger conversation, because this can happen even outside of just AI. Like we implemented a process once. There was a company doing large scale credentialing operations, but it was very manual, very slow, very sort of uh, hunting and pecking kind of manual, like no alert system or anything. We implemented a new system that improved the process. It reduced the amount of time it took to credential someone by 75%. But it was like the credentialing team like fought against it. It was very difficult. Like somebody at one point was crying. Um, and it's important to listen to those people and to hear them out and to sort of walk them through it, because ultimately, generally, it's a function of being afraid as opposed to being against technology. So really, like making sure people feel heard and not just forced to use something. And then if it's one of those things that they're not doing it for like political reasons because of like they're concerned about the environment or whatever, then that's sort of a separate conversation. Um, and so there's a couple more questions, but I will touch on those momentarily. Um, Coming back to this, again, if you don't have specific problems in mind, you don't have any pain points, or your processes aren't documented and your data is all over the place, you're definitely not ready yet. Um, good pilot, good sort of pilot ready organization. You've done your pain point audit. You've had this sort of impact and frequency analysis that's done. You've got your hair on fire problems identified. Your existing processes are documented and generally stable and work, even though they're manual. So it's not just a broken process. Because again, I keep sort of hitting on this point that before you do anything with technology, if you have a process that doesn't work, or you need to already cut down on steps, even if you're doing it manually, you really want to do that before you apply tech, because otherwise you just end up uh, automating the wrong thing. Um, you've got clean data, accessible, even if it is in a spreadsheet. You've got clean data that doesn't need to be sort of wrangled. You have an AI policy and sort of ownership in place, and ideally, you have a leadership team where you have an owner who's accountable and sort of responsible for overseeing outcomes to fruition. This slide deck will be distributed, I believe, but this is being recorded as well to the one question. So then there's a couple other questions in here. So yeah, I mean, the one question: if you're not tech savvy, how do you implement basic automation or AI? I mean, depending on what exactly you're doing. If you're just talking productivity tools, Claude Cowork is fantastic. We're not affiliated with any product. We see people within the Microsoft ecosystem having success with Copilot as well. You don't need to be an engineer to do this, but oftentimes you do kind of get sort of the furthest you can really go sort of with those kind of tools is just a chat bot that can interact with your files, basically. So it's not necessarily doing automation per se, but it is helping you do things, especially if you're like prompting it correctly. Claude Cowork is great. I'll just say it right now. Claude is dramatically better than ChatGPT in 2026. The Gemini tools are quite good as well. Respectfully, ChatGPT has sort of fallen off a little bit. They're trying to recover by sort of stripping away a lot of their sort of side projects. But in terms of like high octane business use cases, almost nobody that we're working with is using OpenAI for sort of production facing things. It is what it is. It's not meant to be a diss. Um, but yeah, it's a good starting point to, onboard with Claude Cowork. Use a team plan though, and again, these things can get a little bit expensive if you're not careful with usage. But have an AI policy before you do that for sure. So even if you're not tech savvy. Um, so then, as far as the next question, it says, any advice on how to get employees to adhere to a new AI policy, i.e., stop using ChatGPT? Well, you want to make them sign it. You want them to sign the AI policy, and I guess the real question is, if you have control of the devices that they're using, like say you're using an intranet, there are ways to what's the word for it? There's ways to uh, restrict sort of websites that they can go to from an IT standpoint. So it could be an IT question. If they're using their own phones and their own devices and they have a personal chat GPT account, you tell them not to use it and they're using it. That is sort of hard to measure. That is kind of a management question. And we see different groups doing different things. We see some groups saying, like, if we can't see you using our AI accounts, there's like compensation sort of implications for it. That one, it's a little more sort of the stick instead of the carrot. But you see big companies doing that, like the Big Four is doing that in a lot of cases where it's like your AI usage is directly tied to your compensation. And that's, you could argue is a little bit dystopian. But if you don't have control of their devices, it's sort of hard to get them to stop doing something. But like, if you get them to sign it, you explain to them like, hey, you're not doing this. Like, you can't put company data into your personal ChatGPT account. Unfortunately, that is a little bit more of an honor system. But if you have any sort of IT control over the systems that they're interacting with, just block ChatGPT and then call it a day. And then if you have your own accounts, you can measure whether or not they're using it. So even if you don't have control over their devices, if you have a Claude team account, or if you have, some of these other sort of team plans, you can see usage on a per user basis. So if you see someone's not using it, then you can have sort of a, disciplinary conversation about that. But again, you really don't want people to feel like you're forcing them, or that it's punitive or vicious, for lack of a better word. Okay, so we got a few more, and these are great questions coming in. So I'm going to go through the rest of these slides, and then I'll answer the rest of these questions. So this is an interesting slide. It's something that we see often, sort of to build, buy, or partner, the honest trade-offs. So you've got sort of three options. You have sort of buying off the shelf tools, building internally, or partnering with experts. So there was an MIT study that found that if you build something internally, only 33% of those tools ever reach production. And it can be pretty time consuming if you don't know what you're doing. Building internally is probably the sort of worst option unless you're using low code tools, like Copilot, et cetera. Buying off the shelf products can be good sometimes, but if I'm being 100% with you, a lot of these tools are overpriced and they're generally just ChatGPT with functionality built on top of it. It's a situation where these sort of third-party tools can be rigid in a way that, like I said, they're quite expensive. And if they're not exactly fit for purpose to your use case, again, you might just end up doing extra work, or your process might not actually be improved by this. So if you're using a third-party off-the-shelf tool, you really got to make sure it can work for what you're doing. And for what it's worth, a lot of these third-party tools do require extreme customization and oftentimes an implementation scope where it looks more like this third option, which is partnering with experts. So what we generally suggest, and where we see the most success, is you do partner with an expert that can either help you with a custom tool, or again, help you configure a third-party tool in a way that is AI enabled. Option one and option three oftentimes end up looking similar, except option three here, where you have deep customization to your specific workflow, usually leads to the best results, and also the highest level of cost optimization, where you're not just overpaying for some venture capital backed application that is, barely held together, or not really doing as much as you think it is. There's a whole philosophical conversation in itself about how many of these companies will exist in even 5 years. But that's that. Okay, so we kind of already talked about most of this, but again, run an audit, look at your pain points, plot the pain points, decide whether it's AI, automation, or both. Spoiler alert, it's probably going to be both. Deal with any gaps that you find with your policy or your data, and then do small pilot projects based on that prioritization activity. But don't get into the pilot purgatory. Really ask yourself, what are our evaluation criteria? What are our sort of metrics for success? And then if we're hitting them, let's launch it into production. So, keeping that in mind as well. Couple pitfalls to avoid: overcomplicating things from day one. I see that all the time where it feels cool and you're like, look at my workflow, it's 100 steps, and it's really complicated and interesting, and it feels interesting, but it's not actually like moving the needle. I've always resonated with the philosophical quote that perfection is achieved not when there is more to add, but when there is nothing left to remove. And that absolutely applies to technology. You see all kinds of, spaghetti code monstrosities of technology processes that get built, and then either one person's maintaining it and there's a key man risk, or worst case scenario, a person quits or something, and then you don't know how the system works, and then it's just this broken thing. Don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple. Treating all workflows as identical. Customizing it to your reality. Again, these third-party tools can often be fraught with sort of rigidity that can be sort of hard to implement, or you get stuck in this 18-month implementation scope where you spend an extra $100,000 and it hurts. I know some of you are probably Salesforce users. I know you know what I'm talking about. Ignoring security and access. Enough said there. We kind of already touched on that. And then skipping the people work. Really treating all of your employees as strategic partners here and making sure their voices are heard, and making sure that they understand that they're valuable members of the team, and that this is not, some evil exercise that's threatening to them. This is actually like a huge sort of opportunity for the world. And, I think especially for small business, this is an extremely empowering type of technology that can increase sales and also sort of increase your probability of long-term survival. I like to say, what could go right when we're talking about these things? And, we were arguably in kind of a dystopian present before AI even existed. Okay, so then some parting words. Readiness isn't about having the best tools necessarily. It's about knowing which problems are worth solving. And so, yeah, again, some of those stats: 67% of internal projects don't reach production. 40% of groups don't have an AI policy. And when you partner with experts, you generally see a 2x higher deployment rate into production. All right, so we've got about 9 minutes, it looks like, for this Q&A. We've got a couple more questions. So let's see. We're a Microsoft shop and have Copilot. All users have Copilot, and a select segment have the full Copilot license. Even though we have Copilot to all users, at least a handful of staff say we like ChatGPT better. My assumption is because they're using the regular versus fully licensed version. Does upgrading the licensing make a big difference? 2, are there any good tutorials we can direct staff to for rolling out proper AI training to shape adoption and behavior for using Copilot fully licensed? It's a good question. And the answer, I would say, is that Copilot, respectfully, is kind of considered the quote unquote like worst one, unless you configure it sort of pretty strongly. With Copilot, the sort of out of the box chatbot can be a little more kind of rigid, and the different licensing options give you access to different types of tools. And so there are additional sort of capabilities that you get when you do get the full license. And if you create your own agents, you can also change which AI model is being interacted with. And depending on your license too, even within the actual just pure chatbot itself, you can update the model. So there's different models that you can select underneath. And you should remind them that it is actually, for the most part, a GPT model underneath Copilot. But believe it or not, you can actually configure some Copilot models to use Claude as well. And so you can configure that. The different licensing options do give you different features, including sort of different abilities to interact with uh, different types of content within the Microsoft ecosystems. There are good tools or there's good tutorials even just on the Microsoft website that kind of can go into a little more detail about this. Um, I would suggest doing a workshop. This is something we do with people all the time, where you actually have an in-person workshop where you go through these things, get people talking about it, and sort of show them how to do it. So you could use a vendor for that. You could run it internally, or you could just have them do some of these Microsoft trainings that are free on the website. Um, but 100%, you want to kind of optimize it for your use case, and especially if you can build some agents using Copilot, that can actually be extremely powerful, and you can access them from SharePoint or Teams, or even within the chat interface. So it's just to say that oftentimes when we hear this pain point, it's because it's not configured properly. Versus ChatGPT is sort of designed to be this general purpose thing. You know, so if they are using ChatGPT also like in a non-company way, you really want to make sure that you're kind of doing something about that, because by default, ChatGPT does train on your data if you're using just the web-based tool. So that's a feature you have to turn off. It's turned on by default, so you may be in danger right now. Next question: can companies be comfortable in their data to Claude Cowork using skills? When you install Cowork locally, does it not send your data to Anthropic systems? So these are good specific questions. Um, so again, you have to sort of be asking yourself, sort of zooming out, like, do you have a company account or do you have personal accounts? You need to be able to configure these settings. So it is a setting actually where you, for lack of a better word, you can turn it off and you can tell them not to do that. If people are using their personal cloud accounts, it is kind of more of the Wild West where it's sort of opaque and you can't tell what they're doing. But if you configure it so they're not training on your data, I would say you should be comfortable doing that. But again, give them sort of this principle of least access concept, where it's like, if some of this data, like if a column that has all of the email addresses is not necessary for doing whatever you're doing, then just delete the column before you put it up there, either in that skills file or as just a supporting attachment. Um, it definitely, even if you're using Cowork locally, that is still, it's essentially the same thing as using the Claude website. So if you don't have it configured for them to not train on your data, it will definitely still be interacting with Anthropic systems, and they could use it for training. And even if you have the data training feature turned off, like where they won't train on your data, all of these AI models, including Copilot, are still sending your data to their servers, and it's in a database. That's how your chats kind of get recovered. So all that data is sort of there, evergreen in the form of chats. The files themselves for Claude Cowork are local to whatever system you're sharing, unless you're sharing like Google Drive or whatever. So your files aren't going up there, but the chats definitely are. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and then we have another question here. Do you see ROI modeling varies by use case coming into play at the readiness stage in terms of exec approval for AI projects, et cetera? That's a great question, Dave. And I think that when we're talking about, sort of exercise of mapping out your pain points, it is a sort of option when we're talking about high impact, high frequency, that the impact in terms of being able to quantify that could be in terms of financial return. So, for example, what I was explaining, where it's like you've got a process that's taking 4 days to complete, and there were two people working on that for 8 hours a day. That was 64 hours, and I believe those people were being paid like, I think like $50 an hour, and so that was $3,200 to run payroll every single time. Versus we changed it to a 4 hour process, and those two people were running it, and so it was $400. And so it was a situation where they, in that situation, had a $2,800 weekly cost savings. So I think definitely that ROI modeling can be useful. And for what it's worth, without going too much into the weeds on it, a lot of the time you're seeing cost savings as opposed to increased revenue. In some cases, you do see increased revenue, like when we installed a chatbot on a client's public facing website, they had about a 25% increase in sales. But a lot of the time it's more like, oh, it's just cheaper to do this activity now versus this is revenue generating. But in some cases, you can see revenue generating activities. um, okay. So then we got another question. What about a very small security team of two people? Or sorry, excuse me. We're a very small team of two people. My brain isn't working. Very small team of two people who are very security conscious. Should we just install private, offline slash open source models like Llama on their machines? You could do that. Open source models definitely do have a place in this conversation, and I do think that it's good that sort of the meta people are doing open source and kind of pushing these open source models. And I think open source is in the long term going to be the future. It'd be interesting to see kind of where OpenAI is in 5 to 10 years, but I digress. You could do that. Transparently, the performance is not generally as good. So it just depends on what it is that you're doing. But it is definitely a situation where you see that strategy, and if the performance characteristics work for you and you feel like your evaluation metrics are sort of being conformed to, then it works. But if you have an AI policy and if you have the settings configured properly, I would say that it might be overkill to do that. It depends, on exactly what you're doing and what your data is. But even large scale, finance teams and banking groups and healthcare organizations are interacting with these systems, and so compliance and data security are definitely important to consider. But if we can't trust these companies to sort of contractually do what they're saying they're going to do with our data, it's worth questioning if, why do we have email? Why do we have Excel? Why do we have all these other tools with all of our data in it? We're trusting them for that, but not for this. But it's an absolutely legitimate strategy, John, to use offline open source models. But again, the performance may not be as good than compared to these cutting edge systems. So I think that's it on the questions. Does anybody have anything else that they have a question about before we adjourn? And again, if anybody's, wanting to do more of an in-depth audit or a workshop about this, or they need help, definitely feel free to reach out to the chamber or myself, and we can definitely help you kind of make decisions about that.
Thank you, Rock. And, again, thank you. So much valuable information, especially I know at the chamber, we're talking about what kind of AI tool we can get. And I found this very helpful for even just our own team's sake. So again, if anyone has any additional questions, you can reach out to the chamber team, or you can reach out to Rock directly. His contact info is still on the screen. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to our next AI webinar series in May on the third Friday. We'll see you all then. Take care. Have a great day.